Broke office assistant warned the Millionaire CEO do not sign. What he later did shocked everyone. Walter was seconds away from signing. The contract was already on the table. The room was silent. The decision had been made. Then, someone who wasn't supposed to speak leaned in. "Don't sign that." Walter's hand stopped. The voice didn't belong to an advisor. It didn't belong to the board. It came from Linda, the quiet assistant who handled paperwork after everyone else had gone home. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't explain. She only said one thing. "If you sign this, you won't own this company by the end of the month." No one else heard her. The room stayed calm, confident, unaware. But Walter didn't sign. And that single pause would cost someone everything. Before we continue the story, comment down below which city you are watching from. Enjoy the story. Walter had built his entire career on one rule. When it was time to decide, he decided. No second guessing, no delays, no looking back. That rule was the reason he now stood at the head of a company worth more than most people could imagine. Investors trusted him because he moved fast. Executives followed him because he never wavered. Deals closed because Walter Cross did not freeze when pressure arrived. The room around him reflected that confidence. A long glass table, floor-to-ceiling windows, a skyline that reminded everyone inside who held the power. Executives sat comfortably in their chairs, already speaking about the future in quiet, assured tones. This meeting was supposed to be a formality. The acquisition had been reviewed, approved, praised. Lawyers had signed off. Analysts had run the numbers. There were no alarms, no objections, no reason to slow down. And sitting just to Walter's right was Roger. Roger had been there since the beginning, long before success turned friendships into liabilities, long before money complicated loyalty. They had built the company together, one risk at a time, trusting each other when no one else did. If Roger said the deal was clean, Walter believed him. Roger leaned forward slightly, his voice calm and steady. "All we need now is your signature." Walter glanced down at the document. It looked ordinary, too ordinary for something that would decide the future of everything he had built. His name sat neatly at the bottom of the page, waiting. This was the moment he was known for, the moment where hesitation usually disappeared. Walter reached for the pen. That was when something unusual happened. The door opened quietly. No announcement, no interruption. Just a soft movement that barely registered in the room. A woman stepped inside carrying a thin folder. Linda, the assistant. Most people didn't look up. They rarely did when she entered. She worked late, moved quietly, and kept her head down. She was part of the background, useful, invisible, forgettable. She placed the folder on the table, just as she had done dozens of times before. Then she leaned closer to Walter. Too close. Her voice was low, controlled, certain. "Don't sign that." Walter's hand stopped. The pen hovered above the page. For the first time in years, Walter didn't move forward. He didn't know why he listened. He only knew that in a room full of powerful voices, the quietest one had just made him pause. And that pause would change everything. Linda had learned early that being unnoticed was a skill. Not everyone had it. Some people tried too hard to disappear and failed. Others demanded attention without realizing it. Linda did neither. She moved through the office the same way she handled her work, quietly, efficiently, without friction. Most executives knew her face, but not her name. She handled document routing after hours, updated schedules, versioned files, the kind of work no one thought about unless it went wrong. That suited her just fine. Linda arrived before most people and left after they were gone. She saw the office when it was loud and when it was honest. She noticed which floors stayed lit late, which doors were always closed, which files were revised too often for comfort. She never commented on any of it. At least, not out loud. On the day of the signing, Linda's routine hadn't changed. She had been finishing a final document check when a detail caught her attention. Again, a version number that didn't align. Nothing dramatic, just a small inconsistency buried deep enough that no one rushing would notice. It wasn't the first time she had seen something like it connected to this deal. It was just the clearest. Linda didn't panic. She opened the file history, compared timestamps, cross-referenced attachments. Each step confirmed the same quiet conclusion. Something wasn't right. She closed the file and sat still for a moment, weighing something far more serious than the document in front of her. Speaking up meant risk. Remaining silent meant certainty. Linda gathered the folder she had already prepared for delivery. She didn't add notes, didn't flag anything digitally. She knew better than that. Instead, she walked toward the executive floor with measured steps. The hallway outside the conference room buzzed with muted confidence. Laughter, low voices, the sound of people who believed the future was already decided. Linda paused outside the door. She knew what was inside. Not just the people, but the power, the hierarchy, the unspoken rules that said someone like her didn't interrupt moments like this. She had followed those rules for years. This time, she didn't. Linda opened the door and walked in like she belonged there. Because she did. Not because of her title, not because of her position, but because she understood something no one else in that room had bothered to see. And once she crossed that threshold, there was no turning back. The room didn't react right away. That was the strange part. Walter's hand had stopped mid-air, the pen frozen just above the page, yet no one spoke. No one questioned it. The moment stretched longer than it should have, filled with the quiet confidence of people who assumed the delay was intentional. Walter lowered the pen slowly. He didn't look at Linda. Not yet. His eyes stayed on the document, as if the page itself might explain why a single sentence from someone he barely knew had unsettled him so completely. The numbers were still there. The signatures, the clean margins. Nothing had changed. Except him. Across the table, Roger noticed the shift. It wasn't obvious, not to anyone else. But Roger had worked with Walter long enough to recognize hesitation when it appeared. He straightened slightly in his chair, watching Walter with a careful expression that didn't quite match the calm he had shown minutes earlier. "Is there a problem?" Roger asked, his tone light, almost casual. Walter looked up. For a brief second, he considered brushing it off, signing anyway, pretending nothing had interrupted the flow of the meeting. That was the version of himself everyone expected. Instead, he closed the folder. The sound was small, but it carried. "I want a few minutes," Walter said. The room shifted. A few executives exchanged glances. Someone leaned back in their chair. The confidence that had filled the space moments earlier cracked, just slightly. Roger frowned. "We've already gone through everything." "I know," Walter replied. His voice was steady, but something in it had changed. "I still want a few minutes." No one argued outright. They didn't need to. The tension spoke for them. This wasn't part of the plan. Walter stood. Linda was already stepping back, her task technically complete. She didn't linger, didn't look around for approval. She turned and moved toward the door with the same quiet efficiency she always carried. Before she could leave, Walter spoke again. "Linda." She stopped. Every head in the room turned toward her. "Yes?" she said. "Come with me." The room froze. Roger's expression tightened, just enough to notice if someone were looking closely. Walter didn't wait for a response. He walked past the table and toward the door, already assuming she would follow. She did. The door closed behind them, cutting off the low murmur of confusion that immediately filled the room. In the hallway, the air felt different. Quieter, more exposed. Walter turned to face her. "You said I wouldn't own this company," he said. "Explain." Linda met his gaze without hesitation. "I can't prove everything yet," she said, "but I've seen enough to know the deal isn't what it looks like." Walter studied her. Most people in this building avoided eye contact with him. Linda didn't. There was no fear in her expression, no excitement either. Just certainty. "What exactly did you see?" he asked. "Patterns," Linda replied. "Revisions that don't align. Attachments that change ownership without saying so. Things that disappear once they've served their purpose." Walter felt a tightness settle in his chest. "Who else knows this?" he asked. "No one," she said. "And if you sign, no one ever will." The words landed heavier than he expected. Down the hall, the conference room door remained closed. Inside, Roger waited. And for the first time in years, Walter wasn't sure the person he trusted most was standing on the same side of the table. The break room on the executive floor was rarely used. It existed more as a formality than a space, clean, quiet, untouched. Walter closed the door behind them and leaned against the counter, folding his arms as if grounding himself. Linda remained standing. She didn't sit, didn't pace. She held herself still, as though she already understood the weight of what she had started. "You said you can't prove everything," Walter said. "That's not reassuring." "I know," Linda replied. "That's why I waited until now." Walter raised an eyebrow. "You waited until I was about to sign?" "Yes." There was no apology in her voice, no defensiveness. "If I'd said something earlier," she continued, "it would have been dismissed or buried. This was the only moment where stopping you mattered." Walter exhaled slowly. "Tell me exactly what you noticed." Linda explained without drama. File versions that reset without explanation. Attachments that appeared briefly, then vanished. Ownership language that shifted subtly between drafts. Nothing illegal on its own. Everything questionable together. "It's structured to look harmless," she said. "Until it isn't." Walter listened in silence. "And Roger?" he asked carefully. Linda hesitated for the first time. "I don't know who's behind it," she said. "I only know the pattern points inward." Walter nodded, though the answer unsettled him more than confirmation would have. "You understand what this costs you," he said. "Even standing here." "I do," Linda replied. "That's why I'm saying it now." Walter studied her face, searching for something. Fear, ambition, desperation. He found none of it. "If you're wrong," he said, "this ends your job." "I know. And if you're right," Linda met his eyes, "then you still can't protect me." The words settled between them. Walter opened the door. "Go back to your work," he said. "Say nothing to anyone." Linda nodded once and walked away. Walter returned to the conference room carrying doubt he hadn't felt in years. The room went quiet when Walter stepped back inside. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Smiles tightened. Roger watched him closely, reading every movement like a man trained to notice shifts before they became problems. Walter didn't sit. "We're postponing the signing," he said. The reaction was immediate. "What?" one executive asked. "This doesn't make sense," another added. Roger stood slowly. "Walter, we've cleared this from every angle." "I know," Walter replied. "I still want time." Roger's voice remained calm, but something sharper edged beneath it. "Time for what?" "Everything checks out." Walter met his gaze. "Then time won't hurt." Roger smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Delays create uncertainty," he said. "Uncertainty creates risk." Walter nodded. "So does trust." The word hung there. Roger's posture stiffened. "Are you saying you don't trust this deal?" "I'm saying I don't trust urgency," Walter replied. Silence followed. Finally, Roger exhaled and nodded. "All right. We can reconvene tomorrow." But the room had already changed. Eyes followed Walter as he gathered the documents. Conversations resumed only after he left. Roger remained seated, his expression unreadable. That afternoon, things moved quickly. Too quickly. By evening, an email circulated citing a security concern, access logs, irregular activity, a quiet internal review. Linda was called to an office she had never entered before. By nightfall, the story had shifted. She wasn't a careful assistant anymore. She was a problem. And Walter wasn't told until it was already too late. The meeting was labeled brief. That alone made Linda uneasy. She was escorted into a small conference room on a lower floor, far from the executive wing. Two people she didn't recognize were already seated inside. A third stood near the door, arms folded, eyes distant. No one invited her to sit. "Linda," one of them began, glancing at a tablet. "We need to ask you a few questions regarding document access." Linda nodded. She had expected this, just not this fast. They spoke calmly, politely, almost kindly. Questions about timestamps, file histories, access windows, each one framed as routine, each one steering the conversation in the same direction. Had she opened files outside her scope? Had she forwarded attachments? Had she copied anything for personal use? Linda answered carefully. Truthfully, she hadn't done anything improper. She knew that. But she also knew how stories were shaped, not by facts, but by timing. When she mentioned version discrepancies, the tone shifted. "That's not your responsibility," one of them said. "I understand," Linda replied. "But it was my access." They exchanged looks. By the time the meeting ended, Linda sensed what had already happened. The concern wasn't whether she had done something wrong. It was whether she could be made to look like she had. That evening, a notice went out quietly. No announcement, no explanation. Just a short internal message referencing a procedural issue under review. By morning, people avoided her desk. Conversations stopped when she walked by. Someone removed her access badge without saying a word. Linda packed her things slowly. She didn't rush. She didn't argue. She didn't look for Walter. She already knew. When security asked her to leave, she nodded. And somewhere above, decisions were being made without her. Walter found out an hour later, not from Roger, not from legal, from an assistant who hesitated before speaking, as if unsure whether he already knew. "She's been let go," the assistant said quietly. Walter froze. "Who?" he asked, though he already knew. "Linda." The word hit harder than he expected. "What reason?" he asked. "There was a security concern," the assistant replied. "Internal review." Walter stood without finishing the conversation. By the time he reached the executive floor, Linda's desk was empty. No sign she had ever been there. Walter turned toward Roger's office. Roger looked up as he entered, surprise flashing briefly across his face before settling into concern. "You should have been informed," Roger said. It moved quickly. Walter stared at him. "You let her go." Roger sighed. "Walter, this is exactly why delays are dangerous. People start digging where they shouldn't, or noticing what they should," Walter said. Roger's expression hardened. She overstepped. Walter thought of Linda's calm voice. The certainty, the risk she had acknowledged without complaint. "She warned me," Walter said. "And you removed her." Roger shook his head. "She made accusations without proof." Walter turned away. That night, Walter stayed late. For the first time in years, he opened files without delegating the task. He followed revision trails, checked archived folders, compared drafts that had never been meant to sit side by side. It took hours, and then he saw it. A transfer structure buried deep in the language. Ownership shifting through entities he didn't recognize. Timelines that aligned too cleanly to be coincidence. Linda hadn't imagined it. She had seen what he hadn't. Walter leaned back in his chair, the office silent around him. The deal wasn't clean, and the cost of realizing it had already been paid by someone else. Before we dive deeper, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Thank you. Back to the story. The office looked different after midnight, without meetings, without noise, without people to perform for. The glass walls reflected only Walter and the city beyond, both silent, both exposed. He rolled up his sleeves and started again. Not skimming this time, not trusting summaries. He opened every layer of the acquisition himself. Drafts, subdrafts, archived versions no one referenced anymore. Files that existed only because deleting them entirely would have raised questions. Walter followed the trail slowly. Ownership language changed in subtle ways. Percentages stayed the same on the surface, but authority moved elsewhere. Control slipped through holding structures nested just deep enough to avoid casual review. It wasn't obvious. It was elegant, too elegant to be accidental. Walter traced the entities back, names that meant nothing at first. Then patterns emerged. Shared addresses, shared counsel, shared timing. Roger's fingerprints weren't loud. They were everywhere. Walter leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Linda had said she couldn't prove everything yet. She had been right. It took access, time, and authority to see the whole picture. Authority she never had. And yet, she had seen enough to stop him. Walter opened a new folder. Internal audits. Past partnerships. Transactions that never escalated but followed similar structures. Deals that had almost happened. Risks that had quietly dissolved before reaching his desk. A realization settled in. This wasn't new. It was practiced. By the time the city outside began to lighten, Walter knew two things for certain. The deal would have removed him from control within weeks, and Linda hadn't stumbled into the truth. She had been watching it. Walter didn't sleep. Instead, he did something he rarely did anymore. He looked backward, not at the company's success, but at the moments where danger had brushed past without consequence. Partnerships that fell apart quietly, investors who walked away without explanation, risks that seemed to resolve themselves before becoming public. He pulled records from years ago. That was when he saw her name. Not as an assistant, as a contractor. The title was different. The department was different. Risk analysis, temporary engagement, quiet scope, short duration. Linda. The timeline matched too well to ignore. Walter dug deeper. Performance reviews, internal notes, comments that praised precision without emotion, mentions of observational strength, warnings that were logged, acknowledged, then quietly shelved. Her contract had ended without conflict. She hadn't been promoted. She hadn't complained. She had simply stayed, rehired months later under a different title, a lower one. Fewer eyes, less scrutiny, more access to the background. Walter felt a slow chill. Linda hadn't been lucky. She hadn't panicked. She hadn't acted on impulse. She had positioned herself where truth was easiest to hide and hardest to challenge. And when the moment came, when the cost of silence outweighed the risk of speaking, she had chosen to intervene. Walter closed the file. For the first time since the company's early days, he felt something other than confidence or control. He felt humbled. Linda hadn't warned him to save herself. She had warned him because she believed the company was still worth saving. And now, Walter understood the full weight of what he owed her. Not a favor, not a title, but the truth, publicly, completely, and without compromise. Walter arrived early, earlier than he had in years. The building was quiet, but his mind wasn't. The night's discoveries sat heavy with him, not as panic, but as resolve. The kind that doesn't rush, doesn't shout, and doesn't ask permission. By mid-morning, he had called an emergency board session. No explanations, no agenda shared in advance, just a simple directive that everyone was expected to attend. Roger noticed immediately. "You're moving fast," Roger said when they crossed paths in the hallway. His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp. "We talked about slowing things down." Walter didn't stop walking. "We did, and now?" Roger pressed. "Now we finish the conversation," Walter replied. Roger studied him for a moment longer than necessary. "Be careful," he said quietly. "This kind of disruption can do real damage." Walter turned to face him. "So can silence." Roger smiled, but something in it faltered. By the time the board assembled, the tension was unmistakable. Susan sat at the head of the table, posture composed, expression unreadable. Legal counsel was present. So was security. Walter stood when the doors closed. "I'm cancelling the acquisition," he said. The reaction was immediate. Confusion, objections, questions layered over one another. Walter raised a hand. "There's more," he continued, "and it involves a breach of trust from inside this room." Roger stiffened. Walter connected his device to the screen. One file appeared, then another. Ownership structures, internal communications, timeline alignments no one had questioned because they were never shown together. This deal was designed to transfer control away from this company. Walter said. Not by force, by patience. Silence fell. Susan leaned forward. Are you certain? Walter nodded. I verified it personally. Roger stood. This is speculation, he said sharply. You're reacting to incomplete information. Walter looked at him. Then let's complete it. The door opened. Linda stepped inside. The room froze. Some board members recognized her. Most didn't. She wore the same calm expression she always had. No anger, no fear, no triumph. Susan frowned slightly. Who is this? Walter answered. The person who saw this first. Linda didn't speak until Walter gestured for her to. I was hired years ago as a risk analyst, she said. Her voice carried without strain. I stayed after my contract ended because the patterns didn't stop, she explained carefully. No accusations, no emotion, just sequence. How deals followed similar structures. How language shifted. How urgency was used to limit scrutiny. As she spoke, Walter watched Roger. Roger didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. By the time Linda finished, the evidence was no longer theoretical. It was mapped, aligned, clear. Susan turned to legal counsel. Pause all transactions related to this acquisition. Then she looked at Roger. Step outside, she said. Roger hesitated. For the first time, he hesitated. Security moved closer, not aggressively, just enough to make the decision clear. Roger left the room without another word. The door closed behind him. Linda remained standing. Susan looked at her. Your name was cleared in our system, she said. Effective immediately. Walter exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. The truth was out, and for the first time since Linda had spoken, the company was listening. By the end of the week, the building felt different. Not louder, not quieter, just lighter, like a pressure no one had named had finally been released. The acquisition was officially cancelled. Internal reviews were underway. Lawyers moved carefully. Communications were controlled. Nothing dramatic was announced, but everyone felt it. A shift. Walter noticed it in small things. Conversations that didn't stop when he walked by. Meetings where questions were welcomed instead of rushed. Decisions that slowed down just enough to be examined. Linda returned quietly. No announcement. No apology tour. Just a badge reactivated and a desk reassigned, this time closer to the executive wing. Susan called her into the boardroom 2 days later. We'd like you to stay, Susan said, formally. Linda listened without reacting. Risk oversight, Susan continued. Temporary authority. Full access. Linda nodded once. I'll help stabilize things. That was all she promised. Word spread quickly. Some employees were surprised. Others weren't. The ones who had worked late nights knew exactly why she was there. Walter worked closely with her over the next several days, not as a superior, as a listener. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush. When Linda flagged something, it was examined. When she asked for time, she was given it. The company began correcting itself, and for the first time since the crisis began, Walter allowed himself to believe this was the ending, the right one. 2 weeks passed. The board stopped meeting daily. Legal reports grew shorter. The urgency that had dominated every conversation softened into routine. Walter and Linda crossed paths often, sometimes over documents, sometimes in quiet hallways where the city hummed below them. Their conversations were practical, focused, honest. You didn't have to stay, Walter said once. Linda looked up from the file she was reviewing. No, she said, but I wanted to finish what I started. Walter nodded. The company owes you. Linda paused. The company needed to be honest with itself. That's all. Walter didn't argue. One evening, as the office emptied, he noticed Linda organizing her desk. Not hurried, not emotional, just deliberate. Long day, he asked. Productive, she replied. Walter watched her for a moment longer than necessary. For the first time since the signing meeting, things felt stable, controlled, almost peaceful. And that was exactly why he didn't see it coming. The following morning, Walter arrived early and found an envelope waiting on his desk. No label, no explanation, just his name. Walter didn't open the envelope right away. He stood by the window for a moment, watching the city stretch awake below him. Traffic moved, lights blinked off. The world continued, unaware that something important was about to end. Finally, he opened it. The letter was short, no letterhead, no explanation, no emotion layered between the lines. I stayed long enough to make sure the truth held. The systems are corrected. The patterns are broken. You won't need someone watching from the background anymore. Thank you for listening when it mattered. Linda. Walter read it twice. Then a third time. There was no anger in the words, no disappointment, just certainty. The same certainty she had carried the day she warned him not to sign. He looked up immediately. Linda's desk was empty. Her access badge sat neatly on the corner, placed with intention, not discarded. Returned, Walter moved quickly through the hallway, past assistants and offices, toward the elevators. He didn't call ahead, didn't ask questions. He already knew where to find her. The lobby doors slid open just as Linda stepped inside. She carried a small bag. Nothing more. Linda, Walter said. She turned calmly, as if she had expected him. I was going to leave the letter where you'd see it, she said. I'm glad you did. You're resigning, Walter said. Yes. You didn't have to. I know. Walter held up the letter. You earned more than this. Linda smiled faintly. I earned the ability to choose. The words settled between them. They stood near the glass doors as people moved around them, unaware of the quiet decision unfolding just out of focus. You could stay, Walter said. Permanent role. Full authority. Linda shook her head. That was never the goal. What was? He asked. Accountability, she replied, not power. Walter studied her face, looking for doubt. He found none. I stayed because I needed to know something, Linda continued. That once the pressure was gone, you wouldn't replace it with something worse. And now? Walter asked. Now I know. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, not tense, just complete. You changed the company, Walter said. Linda met his eyes. You did. I just stopped it from going the wrong way. She reached for the door, then paused. One more thing, she said. Walter waited. Next time someone quiet speaks up, Linda said, don't wait until it costs them everything. Walter nodded. I won't. Linda opened the door and stepped outside. Walter stayed where he was, watching her disappear into the morning crowd. He didn't feel like he had lost her. He felt like he had been taught something most leaders never learn, that the strongest voices don't always ask to be heard, and the bravest people don't stay once their work is done. The office didn't change overnight. There were still meetings, still deadlines, still decisions that carried weight. But something fundamental had shifted, not in policy, but in awareness. Walter noticed it first in himself. He read more slowly, asked more questions, allowed pauses to exist without filling them. When someone hesitated, he waited instead of pressing forward. It wasn't weakness, it was attention. The company followed. Processes changed, not dramatically, but deliberately. Reviews became deeper. Decisions took longer, and the outcomes improved. Urgency stopped being the loudest voice in the room. Walter never announced what had happened with Linda. He didn't need to. Her influence lingered in the way people spoke more carefully, in the way concerns were documented instead of dismissed, in the way quiet employees stopped being invisible. Weeks later, Susan mentioned her name during a board discussion. She left an impression, Susan said. Walter nodded. That was the point. Sometimes, late in the evening, Walter would pass the desk where Linda had worked. It remained unoccupied, not as a tribute, just as a reminder. One afternoon, an assistant approached him hesitantly. There's something you should see, she said. Walter followed her to a small conference room. On the table was a document flagged for review. The assistant hesitated before speaking. I might be wrong, she said, but something didn't add up. Walter sat down and smiled, not because there was a problem, but because someone had spoken before it became one. "You did the right thing," he said. "Let's look at it together." As the day ended, Walter stood once more by the window overlooking the city. He thought of Linda, not as someone who had left, but as someone who had done exactly what she came to do. She hadn't taken credit. She hadn't stayed for recognition. She had walked away once the truth could stand on its own. Walter understood now that leadership wasn't about being the loudest voice or the final word. It was about creating a space where the right voice could be heard, before it was too late. And that lesson, unlike any contract or acquisition, was something he would never sign away. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about the quiet voices we often overlook, you're not alone. We tell more stories like this, about courage, truth, and the moments that quietly change everything. Subscribe if you'd like to keep watching them with us. And if you don't want to miss the next one, you can turn on notifications too. You'll find more stories waiting for you in the playlist on your screen. Thank you for being here.